Hello everyone, this is Electra. I'm back from some major driving over the last 2 days. If you saw my shorts, you know I drove to Chicago on Friday to go to the Abraham Bookshop Museum. Not a museum, it's just a bookshop. It may as well be a museum though, that's how nice it is. And yesterday I went up to Madison, Wisconsin to go to probably my favorite board game store called Noble Knight. I also went to a board game store in Chicago called Dice Dojo, near Andersonville, like the Andersonville neighborhood of Chicago, which is on the north side. And it was an okay store. They had a pretty good selection. This is definitely the best board game store I've seen in Illinois so far. They had a good selection. They had a nice size group playing room. There was some big, it was probably Magic, you know, of course, because Magic is just so popular and I refuse to play it. So it's probably half the reason I just don't have anyone to play most games with, which is okay, but I don't know how Magic is so popular. It's just been around for 30 years, I guess. So yeah, I had a lot of highway road trip thoughts. Do you ever like have some interesting thoughts when you're on long road trips? Things you might not ever think about when you're just at home in your normal routine, doing, you know, your normal errands and things around the house. I did, nothing like groundbreaking, but I think I am starting to meld together some sort of ideology. I think that's what I'm trying to develop here, is some sort of ideology to oppose the current regime that we are under in the United States of America. And I think it's going to be some sort of like a combination, okay? How about that? Combination of some leftist thought, for sure, but there also needs to be some concessions, I think, in terms of economics. I've been mentioning this, how I think the left has this huge blind spot where they think they can just go communist and or full-on socialist and like come to power. And I just don't think that's going to happen right now in history at this point in our country. We need to do what's practical and what's possible. And I don't think the future is going to be capitalistic. I also don't think it's going to be communistic. Those are two dying ideologies. I mean, communism is basically already dead. Capitalism is dying in front of our eyes. We're all the economic victims of that. We're front and center here in the United States of America. Unless you're in the top 1%, you are currently being victimized by late-stage capitalism, whether you realize it or not. And I think the basic tenets of capitalism were in the right direction. And I think what we are under now is in no way capitalism. It's called capitalism to placate the uneducated masses into thinking it's a level playing field when it really isn't. And it used to be much more level. And those leveling mechanisms, regulations, whatever you would like to say, needs to come back, but in a new and updated way for the 21st century. Prosperity needs to be a part of any new left-leaning ideology, especially since now that we have a national Southern redemption political regime, and they could not care less in terms of what our economy is from now on. How can I say that? Isn't Trump all about the economy? Aren't Republicans always about the economy? No. In this case, no, because the Southern Redeemers, when they took back control of their Southern ex-Confederate states, when Reconstruction failed and all the Northern influence left the South, they took back their states. They essentially returned it back to slavery in legal form. It wasn't called slavery, but it was essentially legalized slavery via the law. And the South was an economically depressed area. I mean, until outside of maybe like a couple slightly good years in the 1880s, I believe it was, by and large, the whole period from 1880 to 1935 during the New Deal was economic depression, desperation, deprivation, whole families, women, children, working 20, maybe not 20, like 16 hours a day for pennies an hour. And why did this go on for 50 years, you say, right? Like, how come they didn't just vote these people out? Well, they accomplished that by the power that the Redeemers accomplished that by disenfranchising black people that did actually get the right to vote for a very short time in most southern states in the late 1870s, early 1880s or so. And then when the Redeemers, very shortly after they came back into power and they wanted to take things back to the antebellum days as closely as possible, which was not hard to do because even though it wasn't chattel slavery, they essentially they hired people who essentially played the role of the slaves. And in a lot of cases, it was the former slaves, just now working for very little, a pittance of wages and this turned into sharecropping and all these other like predatory labor systems that kept people poor for basically half a century. So what am I getting at? Any new ideology is going to have to be prosperity focused because the current regime they're not going to help this economy. They're already destroying the economy, what little was left of it. And the Southern Redeemers did this also. They stayed in power because they appealed to white supremacy and they disfranchised blacks, poor whites via poll taxes, and of course women. So they stayed in power for decades because they would harp on white supremacy. They were out in they did not hide it at all back then. There was actually a faction of the Southern Republican Party called the Lily White Republicans, and this was when the Republicans started morphing into a different party than they were during and previous to the Civil War. At that, by the 1870s, the Republican Party wasn't really the party of Lincoln anymore, and it was already going in the direction that it would go in later on into the 20th century, where it was just mostly the party of the rich and the powerful and more northeastern in nature. But by appealing to white supremacy, by disenfranchising pretty much the lower echelons of society, if you want to call it that, they were able to stay in power for decades because the people that had the voting power, that had the suffrage, they had the power of the ballot, they were doing fine. They were the very small section of society that was doing fine. That would be like if only the 1% right now had the right to vote. And of course, they're going to vote to keep everything just like it is. In fact, they would be happy if it got worse because then they benefit. And I don't know about you, but I don't like not having nice things. I don't like being in lack of something. I don't like being just not knowing what my economic future is. We deserve better than that in a civilized society. That should be one of the benefits of living in a civilized society is you don't ever have to want for things. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were onto this idea nearly a century ago now for FDR and over a century ago for Woodrow Wilson. That's also why I think the correct answers are already out there, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We just have to get the right people together. We need to start. I've been toying with this idea of the thinking and feeling people need to conglomerate, form this new ideology, and possibly even a new party. The Democratic Party could, if they want to, revolutionize the party, then I suppose that would be fine. But I also don't think that, I don't think the Democratic Party should be part of the future. They've had their chance, they failed, and much like the original Republican Party replaced the Whigs in the 1850s, I think there needs to be a new party that replaces the Democrats now. The only other option is that the thinking and feeling people take back the Republican Party from those that hijacked it in the mid 20th century, and by 1980 they completed their coup. Who were those people? They were the Southern descendants of the former Confederates, and this Confederate Southern Redeemer ideology slowly infiltrated the federal government of the United States, ending the New Deal programs in the late 70s and 80s, and placing us, putting trickle-down economics on a pedestal, when in reality it was Southern Redeemer economics, just dressed up and putting lipstick. They put lipstick on a pig, and we all fell well, I shouldn't say we all fell for it, but most did, I feel like. And so politically, those were my thoughts, pretty much on the road trip. And but yeah, I'll be doing more videos about this here in the near future, and thank you very much for watching. And I hope if you would like to what do you think about what I said? Is this insanity? Am I crazy? Am I just completely unrealistic? But I don't think so. I think this can happen if the people with money and power, if just enough people with money and power want this to happen, it can happen. It very easily can happen, because eventually when people figure out that this current regime has no interest in building prosperity for the American people, or indeed even like developing any sort of economy that can employ us in a meaningful way. I think most rich people are, not every rich person is the 1%. Remember that. There's a lot of wealthier, richer people than the average that are very much not in the 1% who want to make more money too, and they're going to start feeling very disenchanted in a country where economic prosperity is a thing of the past. So what do you think? Let me know. Please like, subscribe, and share, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.